Hi there, everybody. I hope everyone had a good weekend. This is the first reflection I've done in the evening. I'm doing that so that I can clear time during the days to do the grading of your papers. Uh, so I wanted to talk about Chapter 9, Principle 7 in Principles for Building Resilience. This chapter takes us to polycentric governance. I will be adding a reflection in the morning on some administrative matters, but I've been reading over the weekend on governance, so I'd like to take this up. I have to be honest with you. I find this chapter the least convincing chapter in this book, or the least well put together or reasoned. I'm not even sure the definition of polycentric governance is very clear. So I have an alternative definition to offer that I think goes closer to the essence of what this is. Now, before I go to that, I want to provide a little bit of background to the conversation about governance. Why are we talking about governance? Well, we're on a road from leadership to transformation. And our ultimate purpose is to try to figure out what the relationship between those two ideas, those two very big, very general ideas, how that relationship should be characterized. And I can tell you right now, we're not going to arrive at a final conclusion. There are just far too many questions to be asked before we start arriving at useful answers. So I wanted, by way of background, to suggest to you that governance has been an issue ever since the rise of the modern corporation. It goes way back, and it could be argued it goes far beyond that. But let us take it in its corporate form. So we're talking about corporate organizations in general. Think of the modern corporation, the stock corporation, right? You have people who purchase ownership of the corporation in the form of stock. There are various types of stocks. We don't have to go into any of those details. The shareholders own the company. The company should have a board. The board represents the stakeholders, not the managers of the company. And of course, the company has a management. So you can look at it this way. You have a board, you have management, and you have the shareholders. So this structure goes way back, right? And it's quite fascinating to reflect on the fact that the idea of limited liability, I think you all know what that is. It's a protection under the law to the owners of a business. So if they suffer losses, those who seek redress cannot sue them and take their property, right? So the property owned by an owner is safe from those who seek compensation in cases of loss. That's limited liability. And as I said, it arose in the mid-19th century and was discussed long before. And in fact, on an interesting note, Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, opposed limited liability, which is quite interesting because it's very difficult to even imagine the modern corporation without limited liability. So it's a little bit interesting that the father of capitalism did not support limited liability. Why? He thought it would create a diremption, a rupture, a split between the management of the firm and the board, between those who represent the owners and those who run the business. And the history of governance is full of that very conflict. So that's just by way of history. On another historical note, in 2002, the United States passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was all about reforming corporate governance. Now, why? You might recall in 2002, then again, perhaps some of you, well, you were all alive at that time. 2002, I think. So 2002, Enron, which was a private corporation that in essence was a criminal organization disguised as a private company, it was practicing all sorts of crime in various parts of the United States, and it was discovered and made public. And this then gave rise to a hullabaloo about corporate governance. The United States, the Congress then passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This had a predecessor, by the way, in England, the Cadbury Report also spoke to corporate governance. Now, when we're talking about corporate governance, we're talking about a range of related things. Audit, for example, auditing, financial accountability, roles and responsibilities of board members, for example, the remuneration of board members, or the remuneration of management. That's often held by the governance, by the board. So voting rights, meeting requirements, how often governance committees should meet. All of these things are aspects of governance. So you should understand governance in relation to decision-making. Now, there are a number of things this chapter goes through, and I'm going to cover them briefly. There are a number of things it does not go through. For example, it never discusses, well, in my view anyway, never discusses alignment. One of the things that good governance can produce for an organization is alignment between its ultimate goals, its strategic objectives, and the decisions that should follow from those objectives to facilitate their achievement. So alignment is always a serious problem in organizations, whether they're public service organizations, community organizations, any kind of organization, right? Alignment is always a serious difficulty. In other words, how do we ensure that everyone has a hand on the row, on the oar rather, and is rowing in the same direction? That can in part be achieved through good governance. So alignment between your strategic objectives and your transactional activities is often considered a fundamental characteristic of good governance. And this text seldom, if ever, mentions it. And there are other examples of that. It says it does touch on conflict, but it doesn't say much about conflict. And governance is often, in the real world, the way we practice governance, it often is just that. It's where conflicts go to be settled. Here's another feature of the governance that this text doesn't quite go into. They mention it, and they mention it in reference to financial accountability. Most governance committees in the real world are sources of accountability as well. So are you doing what you say you would do, right? A governance committee often has the role of monitoring performance under some project, some program, some piece of work. So that doesn't quite come out in this chapter. either. So governance, in short, is a bit of a swamp, to be honest. That's my opinion of it. And I've been living with it for years. Now, I've only been exposed to certain types of governance, but I think governance is one of the most serious problems we face as a society, to be honest. There are difficulties with governance, challenges with governance, also that do not quite come up in this chapter. I was surprised. I'll give you an example of that. The governance often will function in an organization to not only declare decisions and communicate them, but also to sanction them, to bless them, to say, yes, this will go forward. And the problem often with governance is because the organizations tend to be pyramidal, right? That is to say, decisions come from all points near the bottom of the pyramid, and they have to move up to certain central points to be decided. And the problem there is simply the sheer number of decisions that have to be moved up to governance for decision. So if you live in the real world and you're dealing with governance committees, you will often find yourself waiting for decisions, often key decisions. So they talk about, in the text, they talk about overlap and they talk about inefficiencies, but I don't think they do that topic justice. It is very difficult to combine, or rather to balance, the need for efficient decision-making with effective decision-making. Those are two very different things, and it can be very difficult to achieve that kind of result, where your governance is efficient, so it's providing decisions at the time when they're required, and it is effective. In other words, it's providing the right decisions. So that's just by way of introduction to the topic. I wanted to say those things about it. It is, again, as I said, it's a bit of a swamp. What I would say to you, if you want to move through the swamp and understand what governance is, it's very important. They talk about polycentric governance, but right now I'm just talking about governance. Governance at bottom is about making decisions. That's what it is. So I mentioned earlier that decisions need to be aligned with strategic purpose. That's one function of governance. Without some form of governance, what guarantee do you have that the activities of the organization are aligned with the strategic objectives of the organization? And by the way, if you think that it would be a rare event for there to be such a gap between the strategic objectives of an organization and its key activities, I would suggest that you reflect further. And I suspect you have seen this in your own working lives. It's not hard to see. And there's a reason for it. As I said, governance is very difficult to put in place in the right way. There are all sorts of things that happen as soon as you put people with the big pants on, the executives, the key top managers, and put them in a room. And often with governance, what you will find on a governance committee is the people with the big pants on. Now, what's the problem there? There's no problem there, other than the fact that having the big pants on doesn't qualify you to make informed decisions about, for example, IT policy or HR policy or financial policy. And yet all of these decisions are moving towards the people with the big pants on, whether they understand the issues or not. So that creates an enormous tension inside governance too. Now, you'll note in this chapter, they refer to inclusive governance. I'm not sure they use that term, but they talk about inclusion, collaboration. So they're aware of this, that governance committees tend to be fortresses. They tend to build walls around themselves, and only people with special warrant can knock on the door and say, I need a decision. Now, my point about the number of decisions is this. Often when you go and knock on the door and say, I'm here for a decision, they'll look at you and say, oh, yeah, well, we have 45 decisions to make. So why don't you come back in 6 to 8 weeks? We'll talk to you then. In my experience, that's been one of the key problems with governance. That, and here's another problem, and they don't talk about this. By the way, I just want to say their definition of polycentric governance, let me go to that now. That might be the only thing I talk about in this chapter, so I don't want to go on for too long. But governance is a topic we cannot avoid. Polycentricity is a governance system in which there are multiple interacting governing bodies with autonomy to make and enforce rules within a specific policy arena and geography. This does not even mention decisions. And I would fault it for that, to be honest. This talks about imposing rules. And that's not an essential feature of a governance committee, so far as I know. They may impose rules, but that's not typically what they do. They make decisions. Now, that said, I came up with something different. Here's my definition of polycentricity, polycentric governance. Polycentricity is a fundamental concept in the work of Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom, and they're referred to in this text. The term connotes a complex form of governance with multiple centers of decision-making. That's why I read this out. Yes, it's a complex form of governance with multiple centers. That's the poly in polycentric, or rather, that's the centric in polycentric, right? So you have different centers of decision-making that are coordinated and connected. And that's what this chapter is about, in short. It's about those connections. But I thought at least this definition mentions right up front decision-making. It goes on to say the decision-making units in polycentric governance arrangement are often described as overlapping because they are nested at multiple jurisdictional levels, etc. The point there is just that in a polycentric governance is complex in the simple sense that they're different centers of decision-making that are connected. That creates, of course, overlap, or the possibility of overlap, the possibility of confusion, the possibility of crossing the wires. So polycentric governance is not a simple form of governance, and it's not simple to implement. That is for certain. So that I would add that definition, because I just think it's a better definition. So I wanted to note on 227, again, the authors are quite in my view, humble, and I applaud them. In short, there's a lack of understanding of how to operationalize the idea of polycentricity and governance of social ecological systems. So they're coming right out and saying, we're just beginning to understand this idea, to wrap our minds around it, and we don't quite know how to operationalize it. Now, I wanted to go, I hope I can find it, because I didn't want to go on about the chapter at length. I think it's pretty clear. So in here they say, it's right here. I'm sorry that it took me so long to find it. I think this is, in a way, the most important statement they make in this text about governance, polycentric or otherwise. They say, they talk about how polycentricity is related to the 7 principles, and the chapter discusses that. You can take a look. But here on 241, under 9.6, about halfway down, you see a sentence that starts, these social processes. And the authors are talking about the social processes of governance. So participation, modularity, connectivity, and so on. These social processes include building trust and social capital, maintaining or developing strong leadership, social learning and bridging skills through use of explicit strategies. I'm not quite certain I understand all of that, but what I wanted to note is, once again, we can see behind this approach, the entire approach, but behind this chapter as well, what you can see is there's a requirement for something above and beyond what these authors discuss. And it is things like trust, right? Because the thing about governance is this: an awful lot of people look at governance as an administrative issue or as an administrative task. So you establish some kind of system to make decisions, and that's your governance. But if you think about good governance, how do you get anything like good governance? Forget about the manner of governance, polycentric, inclusive, whatever it is, call it whatever it is. How do you get any kind of governance, effective governance, efficient governance, without trust, right? Without a willingness to collaborate, a desire to work with others. So what I'm trying to say to you is governance is here, and underneath it, its foundation is not in governance, right? Governance does not ground itself. Governance, if it is to be good, has to be grounded in trust, communication, vulnerability, the willingness to open up, active listening, right? Like, this is what I find and have always found. And again, this is my opinion, but I've always found people agonize over the details of governance. I myself have written at least 15 terms of reference for governance committees over the course of my career. And this is how it works. You write it up. I've written lots of them. I have some idea what I'm doing. So I write up a draft. I give it to the people with the big pants on. And they agonize over it. It can take 3 or 4 months to create a terms of reference for a governance committee that has 6 people on it, right? It's just astounding to me that they will go through the terms of reference in great detail, and they'll edit every single word, and yet they never go to the foundation. The foundation is invisible in most organizations. The foundation is trust. It's a series of competencies, what I would call competencies, that serve to support effective governance. So if you think governance, when we talk about implementing governance, as these authors do, we need to see that we will fail to achieve that end if we do not go below governance, that is, to the human foundation of governance. And the interesting thing about that is that's where you open the door to leadership, right? You open the door to leadership because it can be argued, and we'll talk about it in the course of our studies, it can be argued that leadership is what builds trust, right? It's the human dimension that helps us gain trust, right? I mentioned vulnerability. That's another feature, it could be argued, of a good leader, right? So I don't want to carry on for too long here, but my point is governance tends to be seen as an administrative approach to decision making, and the authors approach it from different angles, and the text is useful, in my opinion, as a description of some of the key dimensions of governance. Some of them are left out, as I've mentioned. But in any case, I would suggest to you that good governance, the ability to build polycentric governance among different actors in different places at different centers, requires more than anything else. It requires a foundation in trust, in communication, in active listening, in judgment, and those are characteristics of leadership, right? Or we could call them that for now. We'll just park them there. My point is, this approach requires something else. I would say, if you wanted my opinion, it requires OD, organization development. The leadership would have to set out to build a trusting organization. And if that is achieved, any governance built on top of it should work. Now, that doesn't follow, but could work and should work if the right steps are taken. So let me stop there. I didn't want to go on about this chapter for very long. I might have a few things to say about it, but in my opinion, most of what they say is by way of associating polycentric governance with the other principles of resilience that the book discusses. So with that, I will conclude this little talk. I'm sorry if it's been a little bit patchy. I'm not very fond of this chapter. I don't think it's very clear. So, but that's enough, I think, for us at this point to look at polycentric governance as one form of governance, which is related in the ways they describe to resilience. So, and it should be obvious, I think. So you look at polycentric governance, what's the fundamental feature of it? Connectivity. If you don't have connectivity, how do you connect one center to another? If you cannot connect one center to another, how do you arrive at decisions, joint decisions, right? So I think those connections are pretty clear. Modularity, well, if you have 3 or 4 centers of decision, if one breaks down, you have 3 others, right? So modularity is built into a polycentric approach. So what I'd like to do as we discuss governance is look at some of the other emerging issues of governance. Governance is still a very hot issue. And the last point I want to make, I've made it before, there are a whole kit and caboodle of people in this world who believe that governance is leadership. And that's a terrible error. But it's very common. So in other words, so how are we going to lead? I'm just imitating the usual conversation. So how are we going to lead that IT initiative? Well, yeah, they have a governance committee up there that looks at finances. Maybe we can get our issues in front of them. No, that won't work. Well, what about those are how the conversations go. It's as if you were just looking for an instrument with a crank on it, so that when you need to make a decision, you can turn the crank and out comes the decision. And that's what governance is. Again, what that view misses altogether is the foundation of governance is not in governance, right? It doesn't matter how long you spend tooling up a governance approach. It won't work if there's a high level of mistrust in the organization, if there's a high level of disengagement, if there's confusion about strategic objectives. None of it will work, right? And governance committees can become dangerous as well. So we need to talk about it. And that's what we'll be doing this week, I hope, as you do the readings. By the way, about the readings, not great readings, I confess, but I felt I was in a bit of a bind. So forgive me. We'll work through it. I'll be working on the papers this week, so I hope everyone's well. And that's enough from me. I'm sorry. This wasn't very good, I don't think. I apologize for that. Anyhow, governance. Let's do it. Okay. Thanks. Bye.